Few items off the top before I get to your questions. First of all, we've taken another step in our ongoing efforts to disrupt terrorist networks. I can confirm that U.S. forces conducted a precision airstrike near Sarmada, Syria, on November 18th that killed Abu Afghan al-Masri, a senior al-Qaeda leader in Syria. Al-Masri, an Egyptian, originally joined al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and later moved to its Syrian affiliate. He had ties to terrorist groups operating throughout Southwest Asia, including groups responsible for attacking U.S. and coalition forces in Afghanistan and those plotting to attack the West. Al-Masri's removal from the battlefield represents another blow to al-Qaeda in Syria and demonstrates continued U.S. determination to target al-Qaeda leaders wherever they pose a threat to the U.S., our allies, and interests. Second of all, I wanted to provide you a readout of a call the Secretary had earlier today. Secretary Carter spoke this morning by phone with Kurdistan Regional Government President Masoud Barzani. They had a very productive call that was focused on the ongoing fight against ISIL. Secretary Carter thanked President Barzani for the courage of Kurdish fighters and for the KRG's close cooperation with the central government in Baghdad and the coalition in planning and executing operations to free Mosul. For President Barzani, meanwhile, thanks Secretary Carter for the coalition's continued support to Peshmerga forces. Secretary Carter and President Barzani pledged to remain in close coordination as the Iraqi-led counter-ISIL campaign progresses in Iraq. And I do have an operational update for you with regard to that campaign. In Iraq, Iraqi security forces continue to clear areas in and near Mosul despite significant ISIL opposition. The ISF continue to make progress while exercising commendable care to avoid civilian casualties. They've been dealing, among other things, with vehicle-borne IEDs and the use of human shields by ISIL. In the last 24 hours, the coalition conducted 9 strikes, delivering 72 munitions to support operations in and around Mosul. This remains a tough urban campaign, but it will end with Mosul free of ISIL's rule. Meanwhile, in Syria, the Syrian Democratic Forces continue to seize and clear territory north of Raqqa in preparation for that city's isolation and eventual liberation. Those SDF forces are now 20 kilometers from Raqqa. The SDF has essentially closed a pocket of ISIL forces now encircled by their advance, and they are clearing that pocket in preparation for future operations. In the last 24 hours, the coalition has conducted 11 strikes, delivering 35 munitions in support of the SDF's drive on Raqqa. And we continue to see indications that the simultaneous pressure on ISIL in both Syria and Iraq, combined with relentless strikes on ISIL leadership, is complicating ISIL's ability to reinforce and to command and control its forces. Lastly, as Americans prepare for the Thanksgiving holiday, just a reminder that around the world, our troops and DoD civilians are working to protect the nation. And as you might expect, the Department of Defense is working to provide as joyous a holiday as possible for those personnel who can't be home with their families. That is no small task. This week, the Defense Logistics Agency will provide for deployed service members in Afghanistan, Iraq, Jordan, and Kuwait the following: 34,760 pounds of turkey, 32,550 pounds of beef, 21,450 pounds of ham, 28,980 pounds of shrimp, 9,114 pounds of stuffing mix, and 879 gallons of eggnog. Needless to say, we want to wish a happy Thanksgiving to our troops deployed around the world, as well as those here at home, and to their families in addition. And a happy Thanksgiving to all of you all as well. With that, I'm happy to take your questions. Bob Burns.
Peter, I wanted to ask you about the letter that Senator McCain sent to the Secretary yesterday, in which he asked the Secretary to suspend all the development and implementation of all rules and regulations that would change policy at DoD. Has he, in effect, shut down the Secretary's policy-making operation with 2 months left in the administration?
The Secretary will continue to carry out his responsibilities as the Secretary of Defense, as he has up to this point through the end of his term.
Does he have policies in process that he's going to be rolling out between now and the end of
the Secretary will continue, Bob, to carry out his obligations as Secretary of Defense, continue to serve this Commander-in-Chief and do what he thinks is appropriate and necessary for the Department of Defense.
So is he rejecting the request that he suspend his policy-making?
I haven't seen the letter myself specifically. I'm not aware if the Secretary has read it, but of course we'll work in collaboration with Congress, as the Secretary always does. He has a good relationship with Senator McCain, and the Secretary is prepared to carry out his responsibilities as required, and will continue to do so. Phil.
Would those responsibilities that he'll keep carrying out include hiring and firing?
The Secretary of Defense will carry out his obligations as required.
Because, news over the weekend came out that the Secretary had recommended the dismissal of Admiral Rogers. Apparently he's recommending that, but he's not prepared to act on it independently. I'm wondering why would
Phil,
that?
I'm not going to get into the private conversations between the President and his Secretary of Defense.
Does the Secretary have the authority to do that on his own, or does he need the Commander-in-Chief?
Phil, I'm not going to get into personnel matters here, and I'm not going to certainly get into the conversations that the Secretary has had with the President. And the President has spoken to this, and I think that would be best for me to leave it to the President.
But you're saying, Peter, that he did speak to the President about firing Admiral Mike Rogers.
I'm saying I'm not going to discuss personnel matters from here, and I'm not going to discuss any of the private conversations between the Secretary of Defense and the President of the United States.
Does the Secretary have the authority, if he wanted to fire an admiral?
Phil, I'm not going to get into personnel matters here. Yes.
About Afghanistan, as you mentioned, the other day was a big attack. Do you think that Daesh is a big problem than Taliban now in Afghanistan? And there, the Daesh get their weapons from?
So obviously they're very concerned about any reports of violence in Afghanistan, whether it's from Taliban or ISIL in Afghanistan, and concern obviously for the Afghan people in light of this attack. I know that we've worked very closely with the Afghan government to look at the threat that ISIL poses in Afghanistan. We've taken significant steps in Afghanistan under the leadership of General Nicholson to address the ISIL threat. And made significant progress working alongside Afghan forces with regard to that. But it still poses, obviously, a threat to Afghanistan, and the people of Afghanistan will continue to stay very, very focused on ISIL wherever it rears its head, whether it's Afghanistan, whether it's Iraq and Syria, whether it's other parts of the world. Jennifer.
What is the Defense Secretary, what does Secretary Carter think about a four-star Marine retired possibly taking his job? And what does he think about civilian control of the military? And would it be appropriate to receive a waiver at this moment in time to have a retired four-star to take his position?
I know you're going to be disappointed to hear that I'm not going to wade in on potential choices made by the next president-elect with regard to this department and the next Secretary of Defense. The President-elect will make his decisions, and it would be inappropriate for me to weigh in on that.
But does he have strong views about civilian leadership of the military?
I think the Secretary believes that the structure within the Department of Defense is a healthy structure and has served the country well. Again, he's not going to weigh in on who might replace him. It would be inappropriate.
And why does Secretary Carter believe that the NSA and U.S. Cyber Command should be separated? What are the problems with having them combined?
The Secretary has said publicly in the past that it has been worthwhile to look at the I'll leave it at that. It's a question about looking at the most efficient way to protect the American people.
But what about it is not working right now?
You haven't heard the Secretary say that it isn't working. What he's said, and I think what the President has spoken to, is the fact that it's worth reviewing exactly whether or not this is the most efficient structure going forward. Yes, Tony.
A couple things. One on the al-Masri hit. Can you tell us roughly how many core al-Qaeda leaders now are sought to exist now, 15 years after 9/11? Do you have a rough order on that?
Tony, I don't from here. I can try and take that question, but I think what we continue to demonstrate with this strike and with previous strikes is that we continue to target senior al-Qaeda leaders as they continue to pose a threat to the United States. And we've demonstrated a willingness to do that, and I think this is evidence of that as well.
If you could find out, I mean, a few years ago, Secretary Panetta said it was something like 100 or in Afghanistan of Al-Qaeda. That would be useful just for the record, 15 years after 9/11.
We will try and get a number for you. It may be something that we have to look to our other, the intelligence community as well.
I have a couple questions on Secretary Carter. When he came in office, he said he was a man in a hurry. A number of initiatives he wanted to get in place. He's in the end game now with the last 2 months. What are the 1 or 2 must-complete initiatives that he would like to get out before he's out the door?
I think the Secretary has carried out a number of initiatives on his watch that he feels very confident are not only in place, but will survive past his time as Secretary. He continues to devote his efforts, of course, to the counter-ISIL campaign and seeing that through to the end of his term and seeing that as successful as possible while he is in office. And I think he feels good about where that campaign is at this particular moment in time, but knows that there's significant work to do. We've talked at length about his innovation agenda, some of the things he's put in place with regard to that. We've talked at length about the Force of the Future initiatives, which are incredibly important in terms of not just for the here and now and for his successor, but for years down the road. These are changes with regard to our men and women in uniform that will have an impact not necessarily immediately, but for years. And I think he feels confident that those changes are sound changes, positive changes, changes that will ensure that the force of the future will be just as capable as the force he has today.
The Force of the Future needs to be funded. And in the FY18 budget, what is the status of that budget plan? Is it near complete? And is the Trump transition team now reviewing the budget and the budget right now?
Well, Tony, you're talking about a fiscal year 18 budget when we don't have a fiscal year 17 budget right now. So
it isn't being prepared.
Well, let me just make the point that as the Secretary did the other day during our trip, that he's disappointed that we're once again confronted with a situation where we have to deal with a continuing resolution. The Secretary has been very vocal in his call for budget certainty, the importance of budget certainty to this department going forward. And that is a message certainly that he will continue to deliver in his final remaining weeks in this position. I'm not going to characterize where the fiscal year 18 budget is at this point. I'll leave it to the President-elect's transition team to tell you what it is, the information they're seeking at this particular moment in time from the department.
Because you know this thing has to be put to bed by December in order to come out at some reasonable amount of time next year. Is it near complete, or is there still back and forth with the services on it?
Tony, again, we've been focused so much on the current budget situation that, yes, of course, work has been done towards the fiscal year 18 budget, but I'm not going to characterize exactly where it is at this particular moment in time, other than to say that the professionals within this department, including those responsible for the budget, are doing everything they need to ensure a smooth transition, to make sure that the certainty, as much certainty as possible, is put in place for the next administration and for our troops and men and women in uniform. They deserve that certainty. They deserve a better situation in terms of the budget than what they're facing right now.
Okay, fair enough.
Yes, Jenny.
Thank you, Cook. On exchange of military information between South Korea and Japan.
Mm-hmm.
South Korea and Japan signed a military information protection agreement.
Mm-hmm.
What is the U.S. position in this regard?
We've been very supportive of efforts by South Korea and Japan to enhance their own security cooperation. We think this is an important step and a positive step. And, of course, we encourage those two countries to continue their collaboration with regard to the security threats in the area.
The U.S. supports this.
Yes. Laurent.
Thank you. There was some confusion last week when there were reports on the death of the Al-Qaeda leader you mentioned. Can you say, for instance, if that Al-Qaeda leader you mentioned was someone who was close with Zarqawi? And I also read things about this Al-Qaeda being the cleric who really inspired Zarqawi and had really Egyptian-born cleric inspiring Zarqawi. Is it the same guy, or are we talking about a different guy?
Laurent, I want to be I don't want to provide information to you that I'm not 100% certain of. I know that, as it's been conveyed to me, this is a legacy al-Qaeda leader who's had a leadership role, both in Afghanistan and in Syria. But as to his own people he's impacted or had direct contact with within al-Qaeda leadership, I'm not going to speak to that without knowing for certain.
Was he Egyptian?
Yes, as I pointed out, he was Egyptian. Yes.
Back to NSA and Cyber Command. A lot of the congressional opposition to the split is based on the argument that Cyber Command doesn't have the capabilities and personnel it needs to stand on its own at this point. Does the Secretary believe it does have the ability to stand on its own? And at this point, is the split off the table for the remainder of this administration?
I will just repeat what the Secretary has said before. He's been very clear about the importance of Cyber Command, the importance of protecting our own networks, about making sure that we are addressing the threats not only of today but the evolving threats of the future. And this has been part of the ongoing conversation as we look at this structure. And I'm not going to predict the future as to what decisions the President might make. Ultimately, this is a decision for the President to make. Yes.
You mentioned earlier you're concerned about living under a continuing resolution. Could you lay out some of the difficulties that creates, or the particular high concerns you have on a CR taking you into March?
Well, the concerns that you've had, you've heard from this Secretary before, but every time we do a CR, there are implications for this department. It means that there are certain investments that are not being made. We're being funded at existing levels, and that does not reflect necessarily the changes and adjustments that this department feels are necessary in order to make sure we're doing everything for our troops, our civilian workforce, and for the nation's security. There are questions again about particular programs that the Secretary has spelled out our funding proposals for. And the fact that they are remaining at current levels, again, restricts, in some respects, our ability to exercise the policy decisions and the security of this country in the most effective way possible. It is not the right way to do budgeting, and that's been a point that this Secretary and plenty of others have made previously. It is inefficient. It does more harm than good in terms of certainty and being able to put in place the national security structure that the Secretary believes is the most effective means possible for protecting the American people.